So our third snippet looks at Trump and foreign affairs, which is not easy to do for a couple of reasons. First, this is very recent. Documentation is not necessarily there. Second, Trump is, and you don't need me to tell you this, he was a chaotic leader, in many ways a dysfunctional leader with a relatively short attention span. And so his foreign policy was I think, particularly erratic. That said, I do think there are some organizing threads in Trump's foreign policy that were apparent, even in the 2016 campaign when he wins the Republican nomination, and then eventually the presidency. The first is that in the Republican nominating process, and here you see Trump, projecting this tough guy image. Trump was remarkably non-interventionist. He was a critic of Bush. He presented himself as a critic of Bush's foreign policy. He said, falsely, that he had opposed the Iraq War from the start, but it was true that he had started to criticize the Iraq War after it starts to go bad, which is something that most prominent Republicans had avoided. But at the same time, Trump is not an anti-interventionist per se. I mean, he says that he's going to bomb the out of ISIS, and so there's this odd kind of both hyper aggression that Trump promises in the campaign, and non-intervention. And he's speaking to an audience. I mean, Trump's base is basically working class whites. In many ways, along with working class minorities, these are the people who now fight America's wars. And there's a sense that what Trump is saying is resonating with them. Unlike all of the other Republicans in the 2016 campaign who seem to be promising, we're going to bomb this country, I'm going to bomb that country. Trump is basically saying, look, no, we're going to pull back. Which is an unusual approach for a post 9/11 Republican. And then the second is that Trump taps into a very aggressively nationalistic approach. His slogan, "Make America Great Again," has a bunch of different meanings. Some of them, I think, quite unpleasant. But in foreign policy, it's basically an appeal to nationalism. The Trump argument is that the United States is losing internationally. That on issues like immigration and on trade, the United States is sacrificing its national interest for the interests of non-Americans. Now, this is, I can confess my sentiments here. I'm quite internationalist on both of these issues, and I think the arguments that both trade and immigration benefit the United States are very, very strong. But, and this is a critical but, there are areas in which both trade and to a certain extent with regards to wages, immigration, there are losers here, right? It's not that everyone benefits, and Trump is appealing with this kind of nationalist platform for people who had not benefited from the transformation of America demographically, economically over the previous 20 or 30 years. And it turns out that that's a much more significant population than I think a lot of people had realized. And in particular, it's a much more significant population of Obama voters than people had realized. Trump wins the 2016 election by peeling off a decent sized chunk of Obama voters from the Midwest, from states like Iowa and Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio, and then in parts of Pennsylvania. And so, it's not simply an appeal to xenophobia or to racism, although, again, certainly these elements are present in the Trump appeal. With regards to international affairs during Trump's presidency, again, it's a chaotic government. He moves through multiple secretaries of defense, secretaries of state, chiefs of staff. It's not clear that he listens particularly to any of them. This is very much a White House focused administration. But I do think there are three uniting patterns with regards to Trump's foreign policy. The first is a sympathy may not be the correct word, but an unusual degree of admiration for an American leader with authoritarian regimes. I mean, generally, U.S. presidents, even if they do deals with authoritarians, I mean, think of Nixon and Kissinger as examples here, but I mean, we've seen all kinds of this during the Cold War, pay lip service to the idea that they prefer, that the United States prefers democracy. That really is not present under Trump. Trump seems to have no trouble with foreign authoritarians at all. He has a quite warm relationship with Putin. He seems to get along relatively well with the Chinese, and maybe the highest profile example of this, he does a summit with the dictator of North Korea in Singapore, which is a huge propaganda coup for the North Koreans. And the Trump argument here is, it's not entirely a frivolous argument. Basically, it's this "Make America Great Again" argument. Basically, he's saying, look, we don't really care about what happens to foreign people. If Putin does terrible things to Russians, and if the Chinese leadership does terrible things to Chinese, that's not our problem. We want to work cooperatively with these countries if we can get good trade deals, if we can reduce military spending through some kind of arrangements. That's really all that we care about. So a diminution of idealism as a major component of U.S. foreign policy, and a willingness to sort of tolerate authoritarian activity as long as it was not infringing on what Trump saw as America's national interest, I think, is one aspect of Trump's approach to international affairs. The second is a strongly nationalistic. Trump's supporters would describe it this way. Nativistic, Trump's opponents would describe it this way. Approach to immigration and to trade. This is a scene from one of the many airport protests right at the start of Trump's administration. One of his first things is to issue this poorly thought out, to put it mildly, travel ban on a variety of majority Muslim countries, which is modified several times, ultimately in such a way that it's able to be upheld by the Supreme Court. But the initial travel ban was, it was to the extent even that there was a legitimate policy, it was poorly implemented, and it caused all kinds of issues. But a hostility to immigration and a belief that immigration was harmful to American society, which is not an idea that hadn't appeared before in American history, right? We saw it in the 1920s. It certainly appears at various points in the 19th century. But this is not a sentiment that a mainstream political leader, either a Democratic presidential candidate or Republican presidential candidate, had been offering really for 90 years or so. But it's a clear aspect of Trump's approach. And ditto with regards to trade. I mean, Trump is convinced, and he says this over and over and over again as president, that foreign countries are taking advantage of the United States in trade, and that the way to stop that is to increase U.S. tariffs to make it harder for foreign countries to sell goods in the U.S., to force them to make concessions abroad. This is the kind of economic nationalism that had been very prominent in the U.S. in the 20s and in the early stages of the Depression. It fails in the Depression, and so really in the aftermath of that, both Republicans and Democrats alike embrace a kind of free trade approach. So Trump is hearkening back to an earlier period in American history. He generates this trade war with China. The two sides are kind of tit for tat raising of tariffs, but it's a very, very different approach to trade, and an elevation of trade. If you think back of what we covered in this course, we haven't talked a lot about trade, in large part because successive presidents basically turned it over to sort of technocrats within their administration. Never was a major part of their foreign policy. It is for Trump. Similarly, this economic nationalism, Trump believes that foreign countries are taking advantage of the United States. This is a quite famous photo of Trump kind of holding court with the G7 leaders in his first meeting with them. He has a very poor relationship with Angela Merkel, the just outgoing chancellor of Germany. Trump's basic argument here is that these countries are taking advantage of the U.S., that the U.S. is essentially providing for their defense. They're not paying enough for their defense. That they get more from the U.S. market than the U.S. gets from them. I think these are difficult arguments to make, but Trump is very aggressive in promoting them. And I think more generally, there's a hostility to international organizations within Trump's nationalism, whether it's the EU or the UN. He doesn't seem to view these organizations as worthy of respect. So we have a kind of admiration for authoritarianism, or a willingness to do deals with authoritarians, and economic and immigration-based nationalism. This willingness to use personal insult, and then I think the third element of Trump's foreign policy is simply a hostility to the Obama legacy, and a belief that Obama was not qualified, and that he should focus on reversing Obama's policy. So you see very quickly Trump pulls the U.S. out of the Paris climate accords. As with Iran, Obama chose to do the climate accords as an executive agreement rather than through a treaty, and therefore Trump has the ability to pull it out, to pull the U.S. out without going to Congress. So so much of the Obama presidency procedurally seemed to be premised on the certainty that Hillary Clinton would win in 2016. It's like they never could conceive that in a two-party country, maybe the other party might prevail. So they made a bunch of these policies as executive agreements that Trump was able to quickly undo. He does the same thing with regards to the Iran nuclear deal, pulls the U.S. out, and instead reimposes very tough sanctions on Iran, which appear to have some effect on Iran's economy, but very little effect on Iran's development of a nuclear weapon. And then I think probably the biggest policy change between Trump and Obama comes with regards to policy towards Israel and Israel's role in the Middle East. So Obama reflects a bipartisan consensus that I think begins with the Bush 1 administration. We see it with Clinton, we see it with Bush 2, and then we definitely see it with Obama, which basically holds that the key problem in the contemporary Middle East is the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. That Israel's decision to continue occupying Palestinian territory and not to allow for the creation of an independent Palestinian state undermined U.S. support in the U.S. position in the Middle East. And until Israel was willing to act on this, there was going to be hostility to the U.S. in the region. So this is sort of in this view, this is the number one problem. You solve this problem, and then everything else kind of comes along. Now, within these four administrations, there have been some difference. Clinton and Bush 2 are quite sympathetic to Israel, have warm relations with the Israeli leadership. Bush 1 and Obama have very cool relations with the Israeli leadership, and Obama's second term very cold. It's really, I think, the most distant U.S.-Israeli relationship since the 1950s. Trump has a very close relationship with Netanyahu, who's prime minister throughout Trump's presidency, and was quite conservative. Also, just sort of shamelessly flatters Trump. But the Trump team, which in this case largely seems to have been his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, stumbles on to a challenge to this consensus. I remember the consensus was that you can't advance Middle Eastern peace without first solving the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. Instead, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, says, look, why don't we see if we can facilitate Israeli peace deals with other Arab states, because he argues, and here I think just it's not a frivolous argument, that otherwise what we're basically doing is giving Palestinians a veto power over one aspect of U.S. diplomacy in the region. That as long as the Palestinians, basically saying the Palestinians could say no to a peace deal with Israel and everything else has to wait, the U.S. may have to indefinitely wait. So the result is these things that were signed last year called the Abraham Accords, which normalize relations between Israel and four majority Muslim countries. The first two are with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Then quickly after that with Morocco and Sudan. In each of these cases, the United States provides an incentive to these countries to normalize relations. So with the UAE, for instance, the U.S. agrees to sell F-35 planes. With Morocco, the U.S. agrees to recognize Moroccan control over a neighboring territory called Western Sahara, which had been disputed between Morocco, local independence activists, and the Algerians. In Sudan's case, the normalization agreement accompanies a decision by the U.S. to remove Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terror, which allows the new Sudanese government to get access to U.S. Financial credits. But this I think it's a foreign policy success. I mean, you get these peace deals signed. The peace deals have proved to be over the last year relatively stable, especially the Israeli ties with the UAE. The Israelis are just announced they're going to be opening military bases and arms sales with Morocco. So in this case, Trump's willingness to sort of move beyond the consensus, although it almost certainly comes from just a reflexive hostility to Obama's policies, does lead to some significant policy change. Now, the Trump administration concludes in international affairs with the virus, and here we get a kind of typically erratic approach, where Trump initially praises the Chinese government for its handling of the virus, then vitriolically criticizes the Chinese government for its handling of the virus, where he erratically shuts off travel, first from China when the virus first starts to circulate. And then when it spreads into a pandemic, he does an immediate travel ban to basically every country in the world, and so you get these Americans rushing home from Europe, which creates chaos in airports around the country. I think even Trump's most passionate defenders would be hard pressed to argue that his handling of the international side of the response to the virus and the pandemic was a success. But in any case, these are some tentative thoughts on the Obama and Trump years, and I do emphasize tentative here because we don't have the kind of documentary evidence for these presidents that exist for earlier periods.